London, 1858. The city is in the middle of the Great Stink. The Thames has essentially become an open sewer, and Parliament has to hang chlorine-soaked sheets over the windows just to function. But if you think the river smells bad, try walking past a commercial bakehouse. Because beneath the streets, in basement dungeons that make Dickens look optimistic, men are baking the bread that feeds an empire. And they're dying for it, literally. Here's the thing nobody tells you about Victorian bakers. Their average age of death was 30. Not 30 years in the profession. 30 years old. Total. These weren't elderly men retiring after long careers. These were young men dying before they ever got the chance to be old. So what exactly was happening in those bakehouses? Why were these men dying decades before their peers? How much of your daily bread was actually flour versus chalk plaster and bone dust? And what happens to your body when you eat chemicals designed for pottery? Let's descend into the bakehouse. It's 1850. The oven is already screaming hot. The air is thick with flour dust and coal smoke. And you're about to learn why cheap bread came at a price nobody wanted to pay, except the men who had no choice but to pay it with their lungs, their health, and their lives. Welcome to the job that fed Britain and killed the workers who did it. Most Victorian bakeries weren't quaint shopfronts with flour-dusted windows and the warm smell of rising dough. They were holes. Literally. Underground chambers carved beneath London streets, described by one health inspector as resembling the Black Hole of Calcutta, only with more coal smoke and worse drainage. These weren't designed to be pleasant. They were designed to be cheap. An oven installed in a basement cost less than a proper shop, and the rent was lower because nobody else wanted to live or work in what was essentially a brick tomb with a furnace. Picture this. You're standing at street level on a London morning. You descend a narrow staircase, sometimes just a ladder, into darkness. The first thing that hits you is the heat. Even before the ovens are lit, these spaces trap warmth and humidity like a greenhouse designed by someone who hates plants. Then comes the smell. Coal smoke, because that's what fuels the ovens. Flour dust, hanging in the air like fog. And underneath it all, the distinctly unpleasant odour of backed-up sewage. Because Victorian plumbing was more of a suggestion than a science. One journeyman baker testified to a parliamentary committee. Our bakehouse is beneath the causeway. The bakehouses generally are very unwholesome. The drainage is bad, and we get offensive fumes from the gas pipes, water closets and other causes frequently making us quite sick. Let that sink in. Frequently making us quite sick was just part of the job description. This wasn't an exceptional bakehouse. This was standard. The gas pipes leaked, the toilets overflowed, the walls sweated condensation. And in this environment, with no windows and minimal ventilation, men worked 18-hour shifts, kneading the dough for your breakfast rolls. The ovens themselves were massive brick structures that turned these underground spaces into something approaching the temperature of hell. Contemporary accounts describe bakers working in heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Their shirts soaked through within the first hour. Some worked shirtless just to survive. So yes, your Victorian breakfast bread was made in a gas-filled dungeon by men who were literally too hot, too sick, and too exhausted to do anything but keep kneading. Bon appetit. Here's something they don't mention in cosy period dramas. Victorian bread wasn't actually bread. Or rather, it wasn't only bread. Good wheat flour was expensive, and bakery profit margins were thin enough to read a newspaper through. So millers got creative. They added chalk, for bulk, plaster of Paris, for weight, ground bones for texture, and a chemical called alum, which made terrible flour look pristine and white. Alum had technically been illegal to add to bread since 1758, but enforcement was essentially non-existent because everyone was doing it. Millers added it to charge more for inferior flour. Bakers added even more because it retained water. And since bread was sold by weight, water was profit. Your typical Victorian loaf was roughly 2/3 flour and 1/3 creative chemistry. Now, what exactly is alum? It's potassium aluminum sulfate, a white crystalline powder that's genuinely useful for things like pickling, dyeing fabric, and making your organs quietly malfunction over time. In small doses, alum causes constipation and stomach cramps. In larger doses or with prolonged exposure, it interferes with your body's ability to absorb nutrients. Your intestines basically stop working properly. It can also cause inflammation of the digestive tract, and delightfully, it accumulates in your system because your body doesn't efficiently eliminate aluminum compounds. So Victorians weren't just eating adulterated bread, they were slowly poisoning themselves with every meal while simultaneously failing to absorb what little nutrition the bread actually contained. Brilliant system, really top-notch. But here's where it gets worse for the bakers. None of these additives behave like flour. Flour has gluten, those long protein strands that make dough elastic and stretchy. Chalk doesn't. Plaster doesn't. Bone dust doesn't. Which means when you're trying to knead this franken dough into submission, it fights back. It doesn't want to stretch. It doesn't want to rise properly. It's a gritty, resistant mass that requires far more physical force to work than pure flour ever would. The bakers were being slowly poisoned by the chemicals that they were forced to use, while simultaneously destroying their bodies trying to knead those chemicals into something bread adjacent. And they had no choice. In the matter, the adulterated flour came from the millers. The bakers had to use what they were given, and the whole system kept grinding forward because bread was cheap, and nobody with power cared that it was also toxic. Quick question before we continue. Where are you watching from? Do bakeries in your country have similar dark histories? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're finding this dive into food history valuable, consider subscribing. I've got more stories about the people who fed the past, including what coal miners ate while developing black lung disease. Now back to the bakers and their impossible schedules. The day began at 3 a.m. Why? Because Britain's burgeoning middle class had developed a taste for hot breakfast rolls, and God forbid they should eat yesterday's bread like common people. Reformers literally begged the public to stop ordering these rolls, calling it necessary to ameliorate the bondage of the bakehouse, which is Victorian speak for please let these men sleep. But the middle class wanted their hot rolls, so at 3 a.m, the bakers descended into their dungeons. The average working week was 112 hours. That's 18 hours per day, 6 days a week. Their one break was Saturday evening until Sunday morning, roughly 19 hours. And to earn that, they worked 40 consecutive hours from Thursday night through Saturday afternoon. 40 consecutive hours? If you're doing the math and thinking that doesn't sound survivable, congratulations, you're correct. It wasn't. But let's walk through what those hours actually looked like. Because the Victorian schedule was designed by someone who clearly believed sleep was a moral failing. 3 a.m. Arrive at the bakehouse, light the ovens if they've gone cold overnight, which means hauling coal and breathing smoke for the first hour of your day. 4 a.m. Begin mixing dough. This isn't using a stand mixer. This is combining hundreds of pounds of flour and water by hand in massive troughs. 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. Kneading. We'll get to the details of this fresh horror in the next section. 9 a.m. First batch goes in the ovens. Brief moment to catch your breath while managing oven temperatures and praying nothing burns. 10 a.m. First batch comes out. Second batch of dough is ready for kneading. And this cycle continues. Kneading, baking, hauling, sweating, breathing flour dust and coal smoke. Until 9 p.m, 18 hours. Then you stumble to whatever corner of the bakehouse or nearby tenement you're sleeping in, collapse for 6 hours, and do it again. 6 days a week. Every week. Until your lungs gave out or your heart gave up, or you simply stopped waking up one morning. And the bakehouse owner hired the next desperate young man who needed work. The parliamentary investigations into bakehouse conditions were filled with testimonies from bakers who described falling asleep while kneading, waking up when their face hit the dough. That's not an exaggeration. It's from the official record. Kneading dough sounds peaceful, doesn't it? Meditative even. Therapeutic. Maybe you've done it. Yourself. A few minutes of rhythmic pressing and folding, the dough gradually becoming smooth and elastic under your hands. Very calming. Now do it for 4 hours straight with dough that's been contaminated with chalk and plaster. Here's how a contemporary observer described the process. The closed knuckles must be violently thrust into the huge mass of tenacious dough. Not gently folded, violently thrust. Every part of the baker's body would be overflowing with perspiration, which falls in large drops and is amalgamated with the dough he is kneading. Yes, your bread contains sweat. Lots of sweat. This wasn't a few drops, this was overflowing. The observer used that word specifically. Men were wringing wet, bent over massive troughs, attacking dough that refused to cooperate because it was full of substances that have no business being in bread. The adulterated flour wouldn't stretch properly. There's no gluten in chalk, so bakers had to work it harder and longer. Their knuckles split open from the constant friction and force. The flour dust would get into these wounds, causing infections that never healed properly because they'd reopen the next day during the next kneading session. Some bakeries had workers knead with their feet, a practice continued from the most remote and barbarous ages, which is a fancy Victorian way of saying, we've been doing this horrifying thing forever, so it must be fine. Men would literally stomp the dough in large wooden troughs, their bare feet crushing and folding hundreds of pounds of flour mixture. If you thought the sweat situation was bad, congratulations on your optimism. The physical toll was cumulative and catastrophic. Within a few years, a baker's hands would be permanently deformed, knuckles enlarged, fingers crooked, palms calloused to the point of being almost wooden. One doctor examining bakers noted that he could identify them by their hands alone. The constant violence done to the joints produces chronic inflammation, making the hands of even young men appear ancient. Your daily bread was made by men whose bodies were being systematically destroyed, one kneading session at a time, and they had to keep doing it because there was no other work, no safety net, no alternative except starvation. So yes, your sourdough starter has a better life than a Victorian journeyman baker. Journeyman bakers earned between 12 and 18 shillings per week, plus half a quartern loaf of bread per day. To put this in perspective, they made less than unskilled labourers despite working longer hours and requiring actual skill. An unskilled dock worker could make 20 shillings for far fewer hours. A skilled carpenter could make 30 shillings. But bakers, trapped at the bottom of the wage scale, making the one thing nobody could live without. That daily bread ration was often their primary food source. After rent in London's overcrowded tenements, typically 4 to 6 shillings a week for a single room, there was little left for meat, vegetables, or anything resembling nutrition. Tea was affordable, at least, being the cheapest stimulant available. So breakfast was bread and tea, lunch was bread and tea. Dinner, if you were lucky, might include some cheese or a bit of bacon fat. But mostly it was bread and tea. These men were performing brutal physical labour, kneading hundreds of pounds of dough, hauling coal, working in 100-degree heat next to bread ovens, on a diet that was essentially bread plus occasionally more bread. The fancy breads they made, the ginger loaves, the enriched rolls, the pastries with butter and sugar, they couldn't afford those. They made luxury goods they'd never taste while slowly starving on the plain stuff. And remember, that plain stuff was 1/3 chalk and chemicals. So they weren't even getting the full nutritional value of actual bread. They were eating adulterated food that their own hands had made, too exhausted and too poor to do anything else. The foremen fared better, earning £1 to £1.10 shillings, but they were the minority. Most bakers were second, third, or fourth hands, trapped at the bottom, replaceable the moment they became too sick or too slow. One parliamentary investigator noted with apparently genuine confusion, "The bakers seem perpetually hungry, yet they are surrounded by bread." Yes, they were surrounded by it. They made it with their bleeding hands. They breathed it as dust that destroyed their lungs. And they ate it because it was all they could afford, even though it was slowly killing them from the inside. The irony was apparently lost on the investigator. In 1848, a medical study of Edinburgh's bakers found that their average age was 30 3/4 years old. Not retirement age, not the age they left the profession, the age they died. The doctors conducting the study were clear. There were few occupations in Britain more fatal than baking bread, except perhaps knife grinding, which tells you everything about how bad things were when you're being compared to men who literally breathed metal particles for a living. The author of the study explained the grim statistics this way. It is only to be accounted for by premature death and the constant influx of young men to supply the place of the deceased. Victorian bakeries were killing young men and replacing them with more young men. It was an industrial meat grinder disguised as food production. The bakers slept in the bakehouses themselves, either by choice during short breaks or because owners literally locked them in to ensure they'd return for the next shift. This meant spending not just working hours but sleeping hours, breathing flour dust, coal dust from the ovens, gas fumes from leaking pipes, and whatever chemicals had been added to the bread. The air in these underground spaces was thick enough to be visible, a constant fog of particles that settled in your lungs and never left. Almost every baker, examined in various medical studies, suffered from severe lung inflammation. Baker's lung, Baker's asthma, pneumoconiosis, whatever term doctors used for your lungs are slowly turning into cement. The symptoms were consistent: chronic coughing, difficulty breathing, bloody sputum, and a wet rattling sound in the chest that doctors described as ominous. They also suffered from rheumatism, all that dampness and cold stone floors, and constant bloody noses from the flour particles shredding the delicate tissues in their respiratory systems. Skin diseases were common, likely from the combination of constant moisture, poor hygiene facilities, and whatever chemicals they were handling. One doctor noted, "These living conditions often lead to palpitation, diseases of the heart, and apoplectic seizures." Translation: the Bakers were literally working themselves to death. Their hearts were giving out from the combination of physical strain, toxic air, and malnutrition. They were having strokes in their 20s and 30s, and everyone just accepted this as the cost of cheap bread. The lung tax came due early and was paid in full by men who never saw 40, let alone retirement. Their lungs were the price Britain paid for industrialisation, and nobody seemed to think that was particularly notable. The Bakers had Sunday morning off, 19 hours if they were lucky, Saturday evening around 6 p.m. through Sunday morning at noon or 1 p.m. depending on the bakehouse. And what did many of them do with this precious time? They went to the alehouse and drank. Shocking, right? Scandalous. Proof of moral degeneracy, according to many contemporary observers. Some reformers blamed the Bakers themselves, suggesting their poor health was because they spent their one night off drinking rather than attending church or engaging in wholesome recreation. One particularly insufferable commentator wrote that if only the Bakers would apply themselves to moral improvement and religious instruction during their leisure hours, their constitutions would surely improve. Yes, if you work 112 hours a week in a coal smoke-filled dungeon, breathing flour dust and kneading toxic dough until your knuckles bleed, what you really need is more church. That'll fix your destroyed lungs. But other observers understood the truth. One wrote, "Exhausted by the inordinate amount of work exacted of them, how strong is the temptation during the brief periods which they can snatch from labour and sleep, systematically to repair to the alehouse, to stir up their languid frames by means of stimulating draughts. No wonder then if in course of time they abandon themselves to dissipated habits." Translation: these men were so destroyed by their work that alcohol was the only thing that helped them function. Their bodies were failing, their lungs were giving out. They were in constant pain from rheumatism, from infected hands, from breathing problems. And beer, cheap, available, providing at least some calories and a few hours of numbness, was the only medicine they could afford. And then society blamed them for it, because of course it did. The temperance movement loved pointing to bakers as examples of the working class's moral failings. Look at these dissolute men, wasting their wages on drink instead of bettering themselves. Never mind that they were worked like animals. Never mind that they were dying at 30. Never mind that their one night off came after 40 consecutive hours of labour. No, the problem was clearly that they weren't going to church. The Victorian capacity for blaming victims while ignoring systems was truly impressive. If misery were an Olympic sport, they'd have taken gold. There were attempts at reform eventually. Some bakeries adopted mechanical kneading machines in the 1860s, though they were expensive and wouldn't fit in most basement bakehouses. Chemical leaveners like baking powder reduced rising time. The aerated bread company introduced machines that could produce 400 loaves in 40 minutes, which sounds impressive until you realise it put hundreds of dying men out of work without providing them any alternative employment. The Factory Acts that limited working hours for women and children didn't apply to adult men, so bakers continued working murderous schedules well into the 1870s. The Adulteration of Food Act of 1860 was supposed to address the chalk and alum situation, but enforcement was sporadic and penalties were laughable. These innovations came too late for most Victorian bakers. The men who fed industrial Britain did so at the cost of their lungs, their health and their lives. They died at 30 so that the middle class could have hot breakfast rolls. Today, when you buy artisan bread from a modern bakery, made in clean, well-ventilated spaces by workers with labour protections, minimum wages, OSHA regulations and actual breaks, remember the men who came before. Remember the journeyman bakers who never saw 35, who kneaded adulterated flour with bleeding knuckles in gas-filled basements, who breathed coal dust and flour particles until their lungs gave out. The next time you bite into fresh bread, consider, what is the true cost of cheap food? And who actually pays it? History is full of people who did impossible things daily just to survive. And somehow they still found ways to make something as simple and essential as bread worth perfecting. Thanks for watching, and maybe skip the hot breakfast rolls. Those men earned their rest.